What if vampires existed? Day 1. The first human to be bitten by a vampire doesn't die. At first, it seems as though they might. Their heart stops beating and their lungs stop working. But after a few minutes, they start breathing again. Their skin is drained of color and their muscles become weak. It takes them several minutes to get off the floor once they stand up, but at least they don't die. In fact, over the next week, they seem to get stronger. They heal faster than usual and have bursts of energy at random moments throughout the day. However, these new abilities come with a dark side effect. The more they use their newfound powers, the more blood they crave. Their thirst is insatiable, and as they begin hunting down other humans to quench their desire, they quickly discover that being a vampire isn't all it's cracked up to be. If vampires were real, would we know about it by now? Probably not. There are some cultures around the world that still believe vampires exist. For example, in Romania, where the famous Count Dracula is said to have lived. Stories of vampires have been around for centuries. People used to believe that vampires were evil spirits that used people's bodies as vessels, causing them to rise from the dead and drink the blood of family members. As a result, when someone died, they would be buried with a brick lodged in their mouth to keep the vampire inside. Now, of course, we know that vampires aren't real. But what if they were? What if those stories were actually true? What if vampires did exist, but somehow managed to hide themselves from us? To answer these questions, let's imagine a world where vampires are real. What would happen if one of them suddenly appeared in our midst today? In this world, vampires would be considered a special kind of animal, something like a werewolf or a unicorn. And just like werewolves and unicorns, there would be many different kinds of vampires. Some would be small and furry like bats, while others would be big and scary like wolves. Some would live in packs, while others would be lone rangers. Some would drink only the blood of animals, while others would prefer human blood. And finally, there would be vampires who weren't afraid to show themselves to humans, but rather lived among us, hiding in plain sight. These would be the most dangerous kind of all because they would be the ones who could do the most damage. Now let's say a vampire has just bitten someone. What would happen to them? Well, at first, nothing much. They would probably feel a bit dizzy and lightheaded, but otherwise, they would seem perfectly fine. However, over the next few hours, things would start to change. Their skin would turn pale, and their heart rate would slow down until it became almost imperceptible. Their body temperature would drop to near freezing, and their breathing would become shallow and raspy. After a few days, they would be completely frozen and look like a lifeless statue. However, this wouldn't last forever. Eventually, their bodies would begin to decay and rot away. And after a few months, they would be nothing but a pile of bones. But what if instead of dying, they came back to life? That's exactly what happened to the first person ever bitten by a vampire. And it wasn't long before other humans started turning into vampires as well. At first, this was a rare occurrence, but soon it was happening every day. Before long, entire cities were being overrun by vampires. Humans couldn't fight back because they were too fast and too strong, so they had no choice but to flee. Some tried running away into the countryside, but the vampires followed them there. Others hid in buildings, but the vampires broke through the walls and floors to get to them. Soon, there was nowhere left for humans to hide. They were trapped and defenseless against the onslaught of vampires, and so it seemed like the end of the human race was near. But then something strange happened. The vampires stopped attacking. It's not that they suddenly became friendly. Rather, they simply lost interest in humans. You see, as more and more people turned into vampires, the world began to change. Plants and animals started dying off, and entire ecosystems collapsed. This meant that there was less and less blood for vampires to drink, and they had to start traveling farther and farther to find it. Eventually, they spread out across the globe, each searching for their own blood. And this is where things got interesting. As vampires continued hunting for blood, they started coming across other creatures that had also been changed by the rise of the undead. Some of these creatures were monstrous and terrifying, while others were beautiful and graceful. And as vampires interacted with them, they learned that the world wasn't as simple as they had thought. There were all kinds of magical beings out there, both good and evil, and it was up to the vampires to decide which side they wanted to join. It's hard to imagine how long this period of vampire dominance lasted, but eventually it came to an end. Maybe the vampires eventually found a way to create their own blood substitute, rendering blood bags full of red liquid treasure. Perhaps they discovered a way to drain a human without killing them, allowing humanity to survive. Or maybe the humans developed a weapon capable of destroying vampires, such as a special silver bullet. Whatever happened, the reign of vampires came to an end and the earth began to heal. Plants and animals slowly returned, and humans started rebuilding their lives. However, even though vampires were gone, their presence was still felt. All over the world, there were ruins of buildings and monuments built by vampires, as well as ancient tombs that held the remains of powerful vampire lords. And deep in the forests and mountains, there were creatures that had been changed by the rise of the undead, waiting patiently for the day when vampires would return. In the end, the existence of vampires may have been a blessing in disguise. You see, when they first appeared, it seemed like the end of everything. But in reality, it was just the beginning. The rise of vampires led to the discovery of all kinds of magical beings and forces, which ultimately led to the evolution of humanity. Without vampires, we may never have known about these things or realize how much more there is to the universe than meets the eye. And so perhaps we should raise a glass to vampires, the creatures who showed us that there is more to life than we can see or imagine. Thank you for watching. When the last vampire died, the curse was lifted and the world began to heal. Plants and animals returned, and humans started rebuilding their lives. But even though the vampires were gone, their presence was still felt all over the world. There were ruins of buildings and monuments built by vampires. And deep in the forests and mountains, there were creatures that had been changed by the rise of the undead, waiting patiently for the day when vampires might return. It seemed as though the world would never forget the reign of vampires. But as time passed, people began to move on. They rebuilt their lives and started looking forward to the future. They learned from the mistakes of the past and vowed to never repeat them. Perhaps the most important lesson they learned was the importance of tolerance. When the vampires first arrived, humans were quick to judge and fear them. But as they learned more about vampires, they realized that they weren't so different from humans. After all, they had families and friends and they cared about the world around them. Of course, there were some bad apples, just like in any group of people. But overall, vampires weren't monsters. They were just misunderstood. Another important lesson humans learned was the importance of acceptance. When the vampires first arrived, humans tried to fight back. They tried to kill them and drive them away. But no matter what humans did, the vampires were here to stay. The sooner humans accepted this fact, the better. Fighting the inevitable would only lead to pain and suffering. So humans learned to accept the vampires and learned to live alongside them. Finally, humans learned the importance of balance. When the vampires first arrived, they were a force to be reckoned with. Humans were helpless against them. But as time passed, humans learned to find ways to defend themselves and strike back. This created a balance between humans and vampires, and it was this balance that allowed both species to thrive. In the end, the existence of vampires was a blessing in disguise. Yes, there was a time when it seemed like the end of everything, but in reality, it was just the beginning. The rise of vampires led to the discovery of all kinds of magical beings and forces, which ultimately led to the evolution of humanity. Without vampires, we may never have known about these things or realize how much more there is to the universe than meets the eye. And so perhaps we should raise a glass to vampires, the creatures who showed us that there is more to life than we can see or imagine. Now check out another video. What if the world was a simulation? Or click this other video instead. What if the Earth had two moons?